Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Hey, thanks for joining us and welcome to Donnybrook. Great to have you on this program, the last before the big election, which some say for the 5th election in a row is the most important in our lifetime. Well, we've got the panel to discuss these important issues, starting with the news director of the Big 550 KTRS, Wendy Wiese, along with Mr. Bill McClellan from the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, from rawstory.com and the Riverfront Times and KTRS, Ray Hartmann. And from the St. Louis American, where he writes a column on sports, Alvin Reid, the perfect person to give us a quick quip about Tony La Russa heading to the White Sox. There you go.
I come by it honestly, the Reid household, going back to relatives in Chicago, are White Sox fans. We've always been White Sox fans. We were very excited about the season. And if you remember, when Derek Gould was on, I said, don't sleep on the White Sox. Don't sleep on the White Sox. We're getting there. They made the playoffs. Now we got Tony La Russa. We'll be sipping champagne this time next year on the south side of Chicago.
We need to give equal time to the North Sider fan, Bill McClellan.
Yeah, and I grew up on the south side, but was a Cub fan. Never have liked the White Sox. Never liked Tony La Russa. So, I mean, this is fine for me. It's like I can kind of hate watch.
So Bill and I will be going to Chicago to watch the Cubs and the White Sox play next year. Let's do that, Bill. It will be fun.
Can I just say, Alvin, do I have this straight, Alvin? You're a fan of the White Sox, the Dallas Cowboys, and KU.
And KU. And the White Sox did infinitely better than KU and the Dallas Cowboys are doing.
The White Sox are more forgivable.
Guys, thank you very much. This is not Sports Open Line, with all due respect, but I wish Tony La Russa the best as the manager of the White Sox. Okay, Alvin Reid, at one point in your life, you were a member of the Chamber of Commerce. You worked for the RCGA. It was announced today that the RCGA, along with Alliance STL, Arch to the Park, Downtown St. Louis Partnership, and, listen to this, Civic Progress are merging to become one organization called Greater St. Louis, Inc. It'll be under the helm of Andy Taylor, who will be the chairman of the organization. Of course, he heads up Enterprise Rent-A-Car, and Jason Hall, who will, I guess, run the management side of this Greater St. Louis. And by the way, Hall will be a guest of Ray Hartmann tonight on 550, St. Louis in the Know. So they're going to have Alliance STL, which will recruit business, the Chamber STL, which will help with public policy, Central City STL, which will oversee downtown, and then there will be a fourth component, I think, pretty much looking at charity. What do you make of this, Alvin Reid? Our happy days here again in St. Louis?
Well, I think instead of going to 5 or 6 meetings for Andy Taylor and Civic Progress to decide what they're going to do, now you just have to go to one meeting. So, hey, hurrah, move forward, show us the progress, Civic, that you promised to do. But until I see it, it's kind of like I don't believe it. And then Jason Hall, I read the story, but who, okay, good. He's in charge or administration or something like that. He's not calling any shots. I'm not saying it's more of the same. I think it is a little different path, but for that path to, change dramatically and actually help this entire region, the work remains to be done. Let's see what goes on.
Well, let me be a little more optimistic, Alvin.
Was I being pessimistic, Bill?
I thought that the idea, when I heard they were merging, I thought the last person that would be in overall charge would be the guy from Arch to Park. I thought that's like a bicycle riding group. And in fact, they put that guy in charge, and I've never met him. Maybe I'll listen to him on Ray's show tonight. But he's young, and it just seems like an un-St. Louis thing to do. So I think I'm hopefully optimistic.
I agree with you, Bill. I think that it is sort of in recognition of the fact that we are not enjoying the salad days currently and that we are something of a mess. And I think that one of the accusations that could be justifiably made about our fine region, we have too many chiefs and not enough Indians. And I think that this certainly streamlines it streamlines every approach. And I think that the push toward at least what I was reading in the article in the Post about diversity, getting opinions from people, black faces, brown faces, people who have never been really invited to the table. I think it is going to be a fresh perspective, fewer people, and I'm like you. I don't hate it, and I think that's good for this panel.
I'll go as far as to say I really like it. I think it is a great idea structurally. I think obviously it depends on the performance going forward, but it brings several things that I know I've been whining about for decades, which is one, a sense of collaboration and inclusion. Again, we got to see if it happens, but that's one of the things it brings. Secondly, is a regional approach, which governments, we saw with the Better Together example and all this other nonsense. We cannot look to the political class for that. The idea, it's a 15 county deal. Unless we learn to think as a region, we're not going anywhere. A wise friend suggested to me that the real answers to St. Louis probably lie with people who don't currently live here. And I get the sense that these folks, at least in terms of what they're looking at, are trying to develop a kind of a new mindset about growing St. Louis in new ways. Now, having said all that, they got to do it. And Alvin's right. I mean, you can't just, it's certainly not time to pop champagne corks, but I think the idea that it involves that kind of a vision is, and maybe a less, we'll see if it's a top-down thing like it has been.
It'll be interesting. I say this, we don't have any poll whatsoever in Washington, D.C., like the good old days when Richard Gephardt and others were here, Lenore K. Sullivan. We don't have the corporate strength, the days of David Calhoun and Zane Barnes and Chuck Knight and August Bush, number 2 and number 3 and all that. We have a great place to raise a family, but we have huge crime problems. We have education problems. And I know something, every other city is competing at the same time. They're not sitting idle. So, with an airport that doesn't go to Europe, with a workforce that's not that educated, I don't know what this organization can do. I honestly don't.
Well, before I cast them aside and said they can't get it done, the only thing I will throw in is that like we're about inclusion and including, but what has St. Louis's problem been? Yeah, we include a lot of people. We include people that agree with everything we say, okay? And that's what I'm worrisome of. There'll be press release here and this there, and we hired this person and we're talking to this group, and basically it'll all come down, hopefully not, but my fear is it'll come down to they agree with us. And disagreement is a good thing, especially in St. Louis right now. And I ran with you and what I said for me, do it, do the job. I'll be on your side.
In the interest of time, let's move along to another topic but it's kind of a cousin topic. It's not too far adrift, Bill McClellan. Michael Neidorff, the chairman of Centene, one of our largest corporations, was on a panel this week with the president of Walmart and the mayor of Chicago and others. And he said, I think, which was news to most people in St. Louis, that he had funded a study that is now merging the police departments in St. Louis County and St. Louis City, and they're working in North St. Louis as well as in Jennings. Well, when that hit the fan, people started saying, what? Including Ray Price, a former member of the Missouri Supreme Court who's on the police board. He said he wasn't aware of it. And then L.J. Punch, a surgeon from WashU, now with another hospital. She quit today because she said, I didn't know about this. The mayor of Jennings is complaining that she's been out of the dark. We're not even sure if the mayor of the city of St. Louis was knowledgeable about this. So here you've got a corporation trying to do the right thing, reduce crime, but maybe not going about it in the best way. What's your analysis of this?
Well, I would say that there were two problems. One, obviously communication. The second is it sounds like Michael Neerdorf was overselling this at his meeting when he talked about merging the police forces, because according to Jimmy Edwards, the head of the Department of Public Safety for the city, the police aren't going to patrol outside of their jurisdictions. You know, you have that corner of the city that edges up against Jennings, and apparently they had a roll call together that, according to Jeremy Kohler's story, the mayor of Jennings, Yolanda Austin, was at the roll call when they kind of merged for one meeting. And it sounds to me like much ado about nothing. I mean, I hope it works out, but I don't have a lot of confidence that having the police communicate better is going to really make a great deal of difference. And I think Michael Neerdorf was overselling it if he talked about the departments merging.
I don't think it was much ado about nothing. I have to tell you, I'm glad you kind of twin these topics, because this is the polar opposite of the spirit of what Greater St. Louis seems to be talking about. And the idea, I'm with Dr. Punch completely. The idea that the corporate community, or first of all, what's Centene doing running our police department? And second of all, you know, the idea that county council people, police board people and the people in Jennings, most of all, didn't know about how Jennings is going to be policed is beyond outrageous. It is beyond that. And people have a right to be upset. And the interesting thing is the idea in substance might not even be bad for there to be a collaboration between the city and county, but this is precisely what Greater St. Louis.
Ray, if the Jennings police are going to continue to patrol Jennings, and the city police are going to continue to patrol their portion, what is it that the citizens of Jennings need to know? I don't get this.
It's their community. You don't just impose.
No, their police are still patrolling their community, right? I mean, I think this thing's been oversold, right?
Yeah.
If the city police are not going to patrol in Jennings, why? What's the big deal?
I think, I know there's well, Charlie mentioned some. There's a lot of folks that are very upset with this concept that who made Centene the decider of these things? Forget about
this. And this group of CEOs that seem to be behind this. And I agree with whoever it might have, I can't remember if it was Charlie or Ray or Bill, but whoever said that the, you know, their ideal is laudable. I mean, what they're trying to do is laudable, but it is kind of alarming to think that the CEOs, and even though they do have a great deal at stake, that somehow they're involving themselves in law enforcement. As a citizen, that makes me a little nervous, no matter how wonderful the impulse is. I mean, this is better together, shoehorned, and Zoom calls and privately, and it just leaves a pretty bad taste, I think, in the mouths of a lot of people.
What I think happened is when Michael Neerdorf said, I'm going to start a second headquarters in Charlotte, I'm pretty sure civic leaders in the city and the county said, okay, do whatever you want to keep you here. And so they gave him free reign to have more say over public safety. The only problem is, according to the county charter, the police board controls the police, not the county executive. So I don't know.
Well, that's what I actually, my whole thing with it was, okay, whatever we think about it, isn't this impossible? All right, we have a county executive, we have a mayor, we have a board of aldermen, we have the city county council. No matter how dysfunctional, the fact that you launch off into this is the plan and this is what's going to happen, which, Bill, I believe, 12 hours after the initial story came out, this is all overstated. But nonetheless, it's the police department. But give you a case in point. If civic authorities in Kirkwood or someplace else decided they were going to take over the trash pickup in Kirkwood, Missouri, it'd be like civil war out here. So why does this stuff go on? Like, you know, in the city county where nobody knows what's going on.
This doesn't speak to the vacuum of leadership in this community.
Exactly.
I don't know what does.
There you go.
You got Neidorf jumping in there. He's trying to do something, and now he's getting
Charlie.
Reid.
You know what, Charlie? This is the same.
No, it's not.
This is part of the same problem why we don't have Chief Troy Doyle, who should be the county police chief. And it's, again, this is all, Alvin's totally right. It's like, this is totally like, who made, you know, what is, can they tell us what John Belmar's role is right now? He's running police now. And we know he's no longer county police chief. Apparently he got kicked upstairs. It's like people, the lack of accountability on this is outrageous.
It's an interesting issue. We'll see how it plays out. Maybe discuss it again next week. But first, Wendy, it's been reported in the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and I'm not even sure it rises to the level of a story, but the governor who's running for election against Nicole Galloway, the auditor, apparently outstate has claimed correctly that she went to private school. And she was on Ray Hartmann's show on KTRS this week saying she was outraged by that was a pejorative. Wendy, we did some research and found out that you went to a parochial high school. Do you find that that's a pejorative to be described as having gone to a private school?
I can see if I were his political opponent, I would hear in the distance some kind of an anti-Catholic dog whistle, you know, that you're trying to drum up that populist class warfare thing that makes him so very popular in outstate. And obviously, I think he's certainly popular in Jackson County and in St. Louis County as well. But in terms of like melt into the floor outrage, no, I don't feel it. But I do think that there were some dog whistles at play there.
I think
I don't like the governor at all, but I didn't see anything offensive about saying, hey, I went to a rural public school and she grew up in St. Louis and went to a private school. You know, if there's dog whistles, I'm missing them. I mean, I didn't find it offensive at all.
Nicole Galloway didn't say anything about it being dog whistles. She did say she thought it was the lowest he had gone in this campaign. And I think she's right in this context. Consider where he delivered this. This wasn't like a press release. This was him talking to folks in rural St. Robert, Missouri, and him making the point that it was in the context of, well, I started working at 14 and I went to a public school, leaving out the fact that Nicole Galloway, who went to college at a public university, my own, was, it was, when you look at it in the context of where he said it and why, I think it was a cheap shot. I
don't think so at all. You're talking to a rural audience. You want to stress that you're a rural guy yourself. I mean, that's not being offensive to a person who's from a city. I just don't see that.
Okay.
I would just say that if the parameter to be elected, you're unelectable if you went to a private school. Obviously, I think Democrats would have the House, the Senate, the state, the governors, the Hawaii, Alaska, every place else. Right. Like I say, he's just chirping. It's within a week of the election and anything goes. And this
he's still saying that woman.
Oh yeah.
When, silver
That's
spoon.
what she was.
She's just, silver spoon, and I'm just a regular guy. He's talking to the folks. There's nothing wrong with that. That's politics. I get that.
Guys, don't forget, at one point, the U.S. Senate had 3 people from Country Day, Danforth, Pete Wilson, and Eagleton. As a matter of fact, Alvin, I went to grade school with a U.S. Senator from Alaska. His name is Dan Sullivan, St. Angela Marici Grade School in Fairview Park. And guess what? It's never been a pejorative. Anywhere I go in the state, nobody is anti-Catholic. I've never.
No, I didn't say that. I'm saying that if you look right now, if you went to the Senate or whatever, it said like who went to private school, who went to public school, it might be close, but I think on the other side. And then Wendy, if I ran against you for office someday, I would say that I went to the the Jets and the Sharks. Kirkwood High School, and Wendy was out there.
Yeah,
nobody.
I think for you to say that there is no anti-Catholicism in the state of Missouri is one of the most surprising things I have ever heard any member of this panel.
I'm not
say.
feeling it. I'm not feeling it.
It was founded. There were actual anti-Catholic organizations that were founded in Missouri.
In 1854, that's correct.
No,
There were fine people on both sides on that one.
Yeah. Wait a minute.
All right,
Hey,
President
real quick,
Trump.
before we go on, my column that comes out tomorrow, I'm writing about in 1925 in June, a Ku Klux Klan baseball team, Ku Klux Klan number 6, played a all-black team, like not a barnstorming Negro League team, in a game in Wichita in 1925. Okay, and like you were just saying, like, hey, you know, the umpires they found were Irish Catholics because they would be like fair to both teams. You have to see this guy. It's amazing. It was an article in a paper. But yeah, they went to Irish so-and-so and whatever because they're known to be fair because they're Catholic.
Point of correction. I think it's already online, Alvin, if I'm not mistaken. I think so. Okay. Alvin Reid, stlamerican.com, I think. All right, now let's move on to Tuesday. There are so many different races. Where do we begin? Well, Ray Hartmann in this week's Riverfront Times took on the Lavender Koenig race. Of course, this is the state Senate race. Ray, you really went after, is it Mark Koenig?
Andrew Koenig.
Andrew Koenig, I'm sorry. Andrew Koenig up against Deb Lavender. I will say, I know that he is right to the right, but did he not work for 3 or 4 years to have TIF reform about 10 years ago? Don't you give him even some credit for that?
Well, I didn't write about his overall. I mean, first of all, Andrew Koenig is one of 6 members of the conservative caucus of the Senate who think the other 18 conservative Republicans are too, snowflakey. So there's that. And you're right. Part of they are very purist. He opposed the GM plant in Wentzville. I mean, the subsidy. They're very purist on that. Andrew Koenig is the author of a bill that says that, and we don't want to get into a big abortion argument, but that after 8 weeks, any young girl or woman who gets impregnated, including by a rapist in her own family, will be required by the state of Missouri to bear that child. Aside from again, I don't want to go there, but that speaks for itself to me and what a horrible position it is. And Deb Lavender, it's an amazing contrast because you got a moderate Democrat against one of the most conservative members of the Senate. I think it's going to be, determined a lot, like a lot of elections are, by how much the suburbs react to the president of the United States. I'm optimistic that that's going to be, I think Deb Lavender is going to win the race, but I think it's going to be close.
Alvin, that's a pretty Republican district, but of course it overlaps a little bit with the race between Jill Shoup, the Democrat, and Ann Wagner, the Republican incumbent. What are you seeing in those races?
Well, that seat and that Deb's seat has gone Republican Democratic. It has gone actually both ways. The House rep seat she had. Now she's running for Senate. It's a little bit more Republican, but I'm just kind of thinking that, man, a vote here, a vote there, and I think they have changed. That will happen. As for Jill Shoup and Ann Wagner, in my mind, coin toss. I think it comes down to basically who turns out, and I think that might favor Shoup this time. But really, like so many races, I just shrug and say, like, okay, we'll see.
I think you bring up a good point. I think Ray does too. It all depends on certain people in West County. Are they going to come out? And don't forget, when Claire McCaskill was in the U.S. Senate, she pretty much had a lot of people coming out in the county for her. And if Jill Shoup can kind of take advantage of that, if any of that still lingers, I think she'll have a chance. If not, I think Ann Wagner is going to win re-election.
Ann Wagner is, she's run for re-election. She's won. It's just interesting in this dynamic, put it that way, that, things have changed. I don't know if things will change in the country, but things in suburbia, like Ray said, they've changed a little bit over the last 2 years, 4 years.
Well, it's going to be interesting also, Bill, in South County, where Ernie Trachis, the Republican incumbent on the county council, is up against a former state rep, Bob Burns. How are you handicapping this race?
Well, sometimes I handicap with my heart. So, I mean, I haven't looked at any polls, but I'm certainly hoping that Ernie Trachis wins. I think that he not only has done a good job on the county council. He was one of the early opponents to Steve Stenger, but Bob Burns is a very strange Democrat. And as you know, he was kicked out of the caucus in Jefferson City because he made calls to Romanic's KKK radio, cool country, whatever radio, KKK call it, where he used Romanic, not Burns, used racial pejoratives time and time again. And Burns would call in and say, you're a guy who tells it like it is. And Burns's defense for this has always been, well, Romanic was good on the veterans issues. And as a veteran, I've always been offended by that. Burns trying to hide behind veterans for why he supported Romanic in that crazy radio show. So I'm hoping very much for Ernie Trachis to win.
Yeah, with Burns, I never figured out why he was on that radio show, I'll tell you what. But I do know he's been a good friend of labor. And in fact, he was once introduced to me by a friend who's a Teamster and who is also African-American. So I think it's kind of complicated.
I know people who like him. I know people who like him.
I guess I don't have a dog in the fight, but I will say this, that it's the interesting dynamic is a lot of us that want nonpartisan elections are getting their way. Ernie Trachis is a pretty good friend of Sam Page, and I'm not going to speak for Sam Page, but there's a general sense that there's a lot of that Bob Burns would be less of an ally for Sam Page than Ernie Trachis is, despite their political party affiliations. So we're sort of getting nonpartisan government, whether we want it or not. And I don't think the good people of South County much care what I think. So.
Well, I was just going to say, hey, of all, the county executive and all the county council, who has acted like the adult over the last 4 years? And I would probably have to, vote for Ernie Trachis. I disagree with him on issues. Some issues, obviously.
I disagree.
Thank you for that. Hey, guess what? That's all she or he or they wrote. And in a moment, we're going to come back with David Kimball, professor of political science. In fact, I think he's the department chair at the University of Missouri St. Louis, and we'll take another look at what's going on Tuesday. So we'll be back.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network. Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.
Welcome again to Donnybrook. Up next, David Kimball, who's the interim chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Missouri St. Louis, who's been kind enough to take some of our questions. Hello, Professor. How are you?
Good. How are you doing?
We're doing pretty well. Thank you very much. And Tuesday, some people say, may be a day when we set records for voting in the United States. If so, what will that record be in terms of the number of voters or percentage? And what are you expecting?
Right. Let's see. Last time, 2016, we had about 139 million voters, and it was maybe close to 60% turnout. It's looking like it's going to be higher than that. This time around, probably more than 150 million votes cast this time.
Wendy?
Dr. Kimball, in terms of the impact of Donald Trump on the American political landscape and on the two political party landscape, have you ever seen, or is there something that you can point to in our history that compares to someone who has literally turned American politics upside down?
That's a good question. It's hard to compare President Trump to previous presidents. President Harrison, presided over the lead up to the Civil War. Maybe that's a comparison. I think the differences between the two major parties were already there before Trump became president. Maybe he's accelerated some of the divisions a little bit, but his style is clearly different than our recent presidents.
Bill?
I've got a historical question too, Professor. Aside from Trump, could you give us an example, and I hope it's not 1860, of a time when emotions were so raw about an election? Because I can't remember it in my lifetime. Is there a historical election you can think of?
Well, 1920 is a good one because that came after another pandemic, and at the end of President Wilson's term in office, and that was a pretty emotional one.
Running against?
Well, Wilson wasn't running because it was the second term, although he wasn't term limited, but it was Coolidge and Harding on the Republican side, and it was Cox and Roosevelt on the Democratic side, and the Republicans won that one. That was one with a lot of, came after the end of World War I, after a pandemic, a lot of stuff going on then. That might be another one to compare this time around too. So, and that's an even 100 years ago.
Yeah.
Right.
Doctor, a lot of people on the Democratic side are very nervous based on 16. There's a lot of, I think, recreationist history that says the polls were way off in 16 when in fact they weren't that far off. And I happen to be one that thinks there should be no national polling because we have 50 state elections. What do you see? I mean, all indications are that unless there's a huge effect of what they call the shy Trump voter, this should be a pretty solid situation for Joe Biden and others. How do you see the sort of the way the electoral landscape is breaking out by state?
I think overall the time is running out for President Trump, but the national polls have Biden ahead by a wider margin than Hillary Clinton was at this point in 2016. But the swing states are more important. The state polls in many of the swing states tend to have Biden ahead by a smaller margin. So, I'm not making any real strongly confident predictions. Full disclosure, I didn't think President Trump was going to win last time. So, but having said that, I think Biden's in a better position now than Hillary Clinton was 4 years ago.
Alvin.
When I was a young man, and I'm 60 now, so we're going back a bit, a little bit, but it was discussed, or I learned that there were more registered voters that were Democratic than were Republican, and thus the larger the turnout is in any state or any race that favored Democratic candidates. Now I'm going back, but I have not ever researched that to see if it changed, or is that still true, or is that nonsense, or where do I stand on that one?
That's still the conventional wisdom, largely because the demographic groups that have low turnout rates, young people, racial and ethnic minorities, lower income people, are groups that tend to vote for Democrats, although highly educated people turn out more than less educated folks, and those folks trend Democratic. So it's not always clear that higher turnout automatically benefits the Democrats. It depends where the higher turnout comes. There's room for both parties to turn out more voters if they work hard at it and are successful at it. So it's more complicated.
In 2018, the voters in Missouri decided to approve a nonpartisan demographer to realign the House districts, the state House and Senate districts, correct? And now they have a chance to reverse that at the polls on Tuesday by sending it from a nonpartisan demographer appointed by the state auditor to a commission kind of similar to how we did it in the past. Is at the end of the day, this all about redistricting? After all, Michael Barone said last week, it doesn't look like there's any calls for a nonpartisan demographer in states where the governor is a Democrat and the legislature is controlled by Democrats. It's only in states where the governor is Republican and the General Assembly is Republican that Democrats are asking for these nonpartisan demographers. What do you say?
Well, definitely read the fine print on Amendment 3. I mean, it is largely about redistricting and how it's done and what the standards are for it, and whether voters would prefer having more competitive elections and partisan fairness be a higher priority in drawing the district boundaries for the state legislature in Missouri, or if they would like to go back to the old system.
And what's in the fine print that you're concerned about?
Yeah, several things. And there's some debate about whether Amendment 3 would allow the legislature to not count children and not count non-citizens for the purposes of redistricting, and that would harm urban and suburban areas, places that have more kids. That's part of the fine print. It would also make it harder for either side to sue in court to challenge the map that's created. I mean, it would have the governor and the party leaders in the legislature basically appoint the commission that draws or at least takes the first crack at drawing the boundaries. Those are some of the parts of the fine print.
Excuse me, Doctor, can I jump in and fact check our provocateur? The auditor does not name the demographer. The auditor picks a slate of nominees and sends them to the leadership of the two parties in the legislature. They choose the demographer, correct? Am I right about that? It's not a point. The demographer isn't.
I think you're correct. Although I do find it interesting that the auditor, the only democratically elected statewide office holder, was the one who was chosen to have this responsibility, and not the Secretary of State, who's Republican. But nonetheless, I recognize the point made by the representative of rawstory.com. Wendy.
I think that Ray is going to be in the cone of silence next week. No, Dr. Kimball, when it comes to issue voting, we used to be, mainly we would have like there was the one looming issue, I think, for most people. I think that for a variety of reasons, none the least of which is social media and its influence, people are more, in tune with various issues in their political spectrum. Is it a pocketbook issue still today? Are there a number of what are the top issues in your estimation that send people to the polls?
Well, this year, the number one issue is COVID, and the number two issue is COVID. So that's pretty much drowning out a lot of the other issues that are often the subject of our political campaigns. But yeah, in a more normal year, there'd be lots of different issues: taxes, crime, health, education.
And I hate to jump in and ask a second parter, but we in another way of sort of illuminating how fragmented we are. You've got the maskers, you've got the no maskers. It's a big deal. It's not a big deal. Politically, that has to be tough for you to read. Just within the COVID-19 pandemic, you have splinters, right?
Sure, but I mean, the public opinion polling is pretty clear that most Americans want to be safe. Most Americans want to wear a mask. Most Americans appreciate political leaders who take a harder line to be safe about how to deal with the pandemic. That's pretty clear. There aren't two sides about that.
Professor, what happened to Missouri? When I moved here years ago, it was not just a battleground state, it was a bellwether state. As Missouri goes, so goes the nation. We had Democratic senators and Republican senators. What's happened to us that why are we red all of a sudden?
Yeah, that's that's going to take a while to answer, but I mean, a lot of things we've seen a growing divisions of different social groups lining up with one political party or the other, particularly in terms of where you live, urban versus rural, religion, whether you're very religious or not, and particularly positions on a variety of social issues, guns, abortion, gay rights. And on many of those factors, Missouri's overall population leans more toward where the Republican Party is now. And so, I mean, the short answer, I don't know, that may not be a satisfactory answer, but that's sort of trying to quickly answer why we've become more of a red state. We are stuck with the two major parties that we have. Our winner-take-all or plurality voting rules, where you vote for one, count the votes, whoever gets the most votes wins. That kind of system strongly favors two major political parties and not more than two.
Okay.
Ray?
Talk to us about how hard it is to get polling right. It is part science, part art. And it occurs to me that what a lot of people don't realize is a pollster has to decide to try to project who's going to turn out. I mean, you can line up your demographics as well with any particular community, but in a given election, any one segment of that community might be more motivated. And it seems like that accounts for a lot of the differences in the polling. Plus, you've got the technology changing with so many more cell phones than there used to be and so many fewer landlines. How hard is it for pollsters to get it right? And how do you account for some of the very different results you'll get from different pollsters?
Right. It's certainly a challenge. And I think you put your finger on two challenges with election polling, and that is figuring out the turnout and who's more likely to vote than others. And then the second part is how to get people to answer the surveys. More people are on cell phones, they're harder to reach. More people don't answer calls from strangers. But pollsters have a strong incentive to get it right because their work product is compared to an actual election, and we get to see how close to the mark or how far from the mark they were. In 2016, the national polls were pretty close. They had Clinton, winning, and she won the national popular vote by a couple points. Where the polls were off in 2016 was in several states, much of the upper Midwestern states, including Missouri, where they understated support for Trump. And one of the big factors there was this growing division by education, particularly among whites. Whites with a college degree are now voting more for Democrats. Whites without a college degree are voting more for Republicans. And so now pollsters know they need to weight by education, sort of technical term, to try and be more accurate there. I think in 2016, the pollsters also missed some late movement toward Trump in the final week of the campaign. So those were a couple things that went wrong in 2016 with the polls.
Well, can I follow up real quickly? Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, the blue wall that fell, all three of those were under 1%. So they really didn't have to miss them by that much to miss them, right?
Right. Although I know Wisconsin, there wasn't a single poll that had Trump ahead in 2016, and yet he won Wisconsin. So something happened there.
Well, Doctor, you don't know who's going to turn out, but there's been just a tremendous effort from many organizations, many people, including professional sports leagues, to mobilize vote, to get out and vote. That's been going on all summer. Do you see any research, any numbers on people who registered to vote throughout the summer and leading up to the election? And are those numbers like large, or are they marginal, or is there something you could take away from that might lead up to what might happen during the election?
The voter registration numbers don't look that out of the ordinary. What's pointing toward higher turnout is a lot of surveys asking people, how closely you're following the election. Do you intend to vote? And those numbers are higher than we've seen in the past. And we've seen over 80 million people have already cast their ballot this year. I mean, partly that's due to COVID. But just the number of ballots cast and the voter interest that we see in polling are what suggests to me that it's going to be a higher turnout election this time around.
Professor, what do you make about this proposal for what's called approval voting that's before the voters in the city? Maybe you could explain it and then give us your analysis.
Sure. So the way approval voting works is, right, instead of just voting for one candidate, you vote for as many of the candidates that you approve of, that are acceptable to you. So you can vote for three candidates if there are three candidates that you like. And so the proposal is to have two rounds of voting. The first round, all the candidates appear on the ballot who are running. You vote for anyone you approve of, and then the top two, I think, in that then advance to a runoff election a month later, and in the runoff you just vote for one, and the winner there wins the office. So approval voting hasn't been tried much in political elections in the United States. Fargo, North Dakota adopted it recently, and I think they held their first municipal election with it earlier this year. That's the one city in the United States that we have to compare. So it's largely an untested reform. I mean, I think it's the motivation for it is clearly that the last mayoral election, Lyda Crewson won with 32% or some of the vote, and the president of the Board of Aldermen election, Reid, won that with 36% of vote, and so there's some concern that the other candidates split the rest of the vote and maybe prevented some other more preferable candidate from winning. That's what this proposal is designed to maybe prevent. But yeah, it's largely an untested reform, and so I'm not sure it's going to work in practice maybe the way some of the reformers think it might work.
What I thought was so ironic after the last election, one of the most highly visible who was taking part in the postmortem was Joe Biden. And he said that he knew that President Trump was going to that Donald Trump would take the presidency when he saw the rallies and the enthusiasm among the base. If somehow he defies all expectations a second time, what does that do to the field of political science? What does that do to our American political system?
Yeah, Donald Trump's been done a lot for political science. Well, because he's done, in so many ways, he's behaved differently than a typical politician. And so for political scientists, that's been, interesting. Well, we can see sort of how does it go? For example, President Trump appointed several cabinet members, people who, like himself, had basically no prior experience in government or politics. And some of those cabinet appointments didn't work out very well. So, yeah, there's lots of lots we can answer there. But I think if President Trump wins re-election, yeah, we'd have to assess again how come the polling now seems to have Biden in the lead. You know, where did polling miss things? Yeah, there would have to be another post-mortem.
Doctor, thanks to COVID, we didn't have any conventions this year, and the way we used to. And I miss the old-time conventions when people would gather, and the great state of Illinois gives its 46 votes to favor its son or whatever, and there was drama, and it was must-see television. And I'm sure the parties would like to have those days come again. Is there any chance we could have exciting, contested conventions again?
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that. Last night we watched The Best Man, which is an old Turner Classic movie. Henry Fonda and Cliff Robertson about a national convention. Anyway,
I'll watch that tonight.
Yeah. A lot of political scientists would actually prefer that. The argument is that the political parties themselves and the party insiders make better choices about who would be an effective nominee for president. But we're not going back to that. The voters strongly prefer a more open and democratic process where voters have more of a say. So even though I think leaders in both political parties would probably prefer to go back to a convention-style system where the party insiders have more influence, we're not going back to that anytime soon, at least.
That's a shame.
Doctor, from a standpoint of political science, not partisanship, is there any reason that mail-in ballots should be viewed more suspiciously or more subject to fraud than other ballots?
No, voter fraud is pretty rare across the board, both in-person voting and voting by mail. You know, there are several states out west now that vote pretty much entirely by mail. They mail a ballot to every registered voter. They've been doing that for many years now. And those states don't have any higher rate of voter fraud than the rest of the country.
Dr. Kimball, you're from Chicago, and you mentioned just the conventions. I invite you, if you haven't done it already, and everybody else, go to the Chicago Hilton main lobby. No, you don't have to get on an elevator. Go to the ballroom, and when you stand in that little ballroom and you say, like, all that happened in this place in 1968, it's just one of the most overwhelming experiences that you can, ever have. And before we, let you go, I don't know how much time we have, but I got to ask you, like, are you the fugitive? Because wasn't it Dr. David Kimball that
Richard Kimball.
Richard Kimball. Okay, all right, I was wrong, but I was like, are you still chasing the one-armed man? Although you caught him. You caught him in
That's
the
a
most
great
watched
movie.
television program ever.
Great TV show too.
Yeah, great TV show. So I'm sorry, I think he's got the exact same name. Right. All right. That was your brother, and now you're living happily ever after.
Yeah, fortunately, I haven't had to chase after any one-armed man.
There you go. The elusive one-armed man.
Right.
Following up on voting this year, is there by chance any excuse that one could have this year in the United States to not vote? It seems like between mail-in voting, absentee voting, and in-person voting, every stop has been pulled to accommodate people who want to vote. Do you agree or disagree?
I think it depends on what state you live in. I think some states have made more adjustments to coronavirus, and other states less so. I think Missouri has probably made fewer adjustments for coronavirus than many other states. And I think the legislation that was passed in May to offer this additional COVID excuse also created more complications. For some absentee voters, you have to mail it back in. For some, you can bring it in person. For some, you have to get it notarized. For others, you don't. Voting absentee in Missouri was actually made more complicated by that law.
On that note, we have to let you go, but we thank you very much for joining us from the University of Missouri St. Louis. David Kimball, not Richard Kimball, sure appreciate it. And thanks for your time on the 9 Network.
Thank you very much.
Donnybrook is made possible by the members of the 9 Network.